Alright, we're going to pick up with resistance and accommodation. Few teachers used positive or reinforcement to make sure their slaves were working hard. Most of the time they used punishment. So basically lashings or beatings if they messed up, and they were encouraged to not mess up again that way. So we are going to see some cases where slaves rebel against their slave owners. Most slaves used forms of silent protest, a little less direct. An example of this could be them working a little more slowly in the fields, thus not making as much money for the plantation owner because they're not producing as much crop. Another example would be breaking tools or stealing. But there are a couple of cases of rebellion, a couple of examples of direct rebellion, and the example we're going to go into is the Stono Rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion, that's spelled S-T-O-N-O, took place in South Carolina. The governor of Spanish Florida offered freedom to any slave living in Florida. So a group of about 20 slaves met at the Stono River, and they came with weapons. They essentially planned to make it to Florida, collecting slaves as they went from plantation to plantation and killing anyone who tried to stop them. They were successful in killing several white families. But the white militia was able to put down this rebellion pretty quickly. The significance of this rebellion was that laws and codes became even more strict for the slaves. For example, they could no longer meet in groups. And they actually also had to learn English so the planters could understand them. Alright, we're now going to talk about the different types of economies at play. Colonies, with a fun southern drawl like the Southern Gentry. So a social hierarchy developed within the Chesapeake and South Carolina. You essentially had wealthy plantation owners at the top, small landowners in the middle, as well as some white tenant farmers in the middle. Tenant farmers obviously had to pay rent, but they were able to still farm. And then at the bottom of the social ladder was the slaves. If you were a poor farmer living in the South, you were encouraged to invest in both land and slaves. And by around like the late 1700s, around 60% of English families in the Chesapeake owned at least one African slave. Now, the economy of the North, the Maritime economy, was a little bit different. The northern British colonies were involved in the transatlantic trading network. They were able to export lumber, meat, bread, and even fish to sell and make a substantial profit. So already you can see they are not really requiring to invest in the slave labor system as much as the South. So you're already kind of seeing the reasons that the North and the South are going to develop so differently over time. Okay, urban development. We see development of urban, particularly in the North. We see the development of some factories at this time. Examples of like factories you would see would be like sugar refineries or rum distilleries or sawmills. And factories meant, more jobs. So you're going to have a lot of people move to the north, and some of these northern cities are really going to grow in population because of job opportunity. So that's kind of how you see the urbanization of some of the northern colonies really from the get-go already developing more quickly in that urban regard compared to the South. And as far as Seaport Society, a society within seaport cities, much like in the southern colonies. You would have wealthy merchants and landowners at the top of that social ladder. You would have artisans and skilled workers, such as like different shopkeepers. They would make up the middle class. So they had a moderately comfortable lifestyle. And then the lower class would be the laborers. And a lot of times these laborers are white laborers, dock workers, factory workers, servants. You had children even working at a younger age in this lower class. So it just kind of gives you an idea that even in the seaport societies, there's still a social hierarchy at play. All right, I want to get just briefly into the politics, the new politics of empire, and I really want to term called Salutary Neglect. So by the 1750s, most British colonies were under less British control. during the leadership of both King George I and King George II, England was much more concerned about the affairs that were actually taking place within England than in the colonies. So England's leadership at this time kind of turned its attention away from the colonies in America. Not meaning they're giving them their freedom, but they're just not paying as much attention to them, and they're not controlling them as much. Kind of the same way we discussed when William and Mary of Orange were in charge. It gave the colonies a little more liberty. So we refer to this period as salutary neglect. Neglect is obviously a negative thing, but the word salutary means like beneficial and favorable. You may think of Charlotte's Web when Charlotte writes salutations in the web, and that means like good tidings, like I wish you well kind of thing. So salutary neglect actually means beneficial neglect, good neglect. And it's good because the colonies are all about it. They are very happy for England to be leaving them alone. So they develop their own governments, they run their own militias, they manage their own taxes. The colonies are in favor of this. They will not be in favor when England wants to eventually get more involved, and we'll talk about that in Chapter 4 in Unit 2. I want to really quickly go over new Politics of Mercantilism. This is where we'll stop. After this we'll stop. So that Parliament passing the Navigation Acts that restricted the economic independence of the colonies, we are going to see a little bit of that extended even during the period of salutary neglect. And an example of a Navigation Act would be specifically the Molasses Act of 1733. So essentially, it all started when the British colonists began trading with the French in the West Indies. And the French in the West Indies were cultivating sugarcane. And they were making a lot of it. And if you know how economics works, when you make a lot of something, it's usually cheaper. So basically, my point is, the French sold really cheap sugar and molasses. So the colonies began purchasing all their molasses from the French in the West Indies and not from Great Britain or England. And that's their mother country, so England's kind of annoyed by this. But the colonists are just doing it because it's cheaper. But England's Parliament is going to pass the Molasses Act. And within this act, the colonists are going to be allowed to export certain things and trade certain things with the French. But there's going to be a high tariff or a high tax put on French imported molasses, meaning that France is going to have to pay a tax to sell their sugar and molasses to the British colonists, meaning they're going to raise their prices to make up for that tax. The colonists are not happy with this raise in prices, so they actually began smuggling French molasses to avoid this tax. So in some regard, we do see some conflict between the colonists and mother country. And we will stop here and talk about Georgia and the war with Spain in class on Monday, so make sure you listen to this screencast twice if you need to. Write down any questions, and I will see you on Monday. Have a good weekend.